what are we going to talk about today? This is something that has been requested from me recently from some debaters, and that is, how do we approach spec knowledge motions when we don't know facts and are ignorant potatoes? Having a lengthy experience as being an ignorant individual myself, I have some thoughts on this. So this is what we're going to focus on today. However, I would like to start with a few important disclaimers for this workshop. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the first and most important one, facts are important. To be clear, the goal of this workshop is to serve as a last resort. It is there for you in the case that you have done your case file and you still ran across a motion that you are not certain how to approach because there was something that you did not predict, something that you didn't case file in advance, or you just didn't have the time in some extreme scenarios. The point is not to give you an excuse not to educate yourself at all. This is both for a practical reason. It is always better to know stuff, in order to get higher speaks, because I'm going to teach you tools which are going to get you through the basics and help you get usually a solid second or sometimes a first with low speaks, but it always improves your argumentation if you're able to give more specific context and nuance. It usually won't be as helpful in the very high top rooms where people usually do know the facts and you don't. And also it will just make you stress out. And we're going to talk about this soon, but one of the biggest problems people have with spec knowledge debates is getting stressed, and this harms their speeches most. So if you just have knowledge about stuff, it gives you the confidence to speak about them better. So I do highly advise, for practical reasons, to still do your case file. And also for principle reasons, I think it's just a bit disingenuine to talk about things that we are very ignorant about in the passionate way that debaters do. It also tends to systematically be more so true for things that are relevant to developing countries and minorities. Like nearly everyone knows about the American politics, but most people don't know about most political systems in Africa or Asia. So for all those reasons, please do study. However, in the case that you didn't study and this is your last resort, it is not yet all hope being lost. Second disclaimer, I didn't invent anything. This workshop is a collection of many lessons that I've learned from many people. There are too many of them to mention in the credits. Some of them aren't even debaters. Some of this is as old as like ancient Greek philosophy, whatever. So I won't give specific credits to individuals. Some of them also asked me specifically not to, but do bear in mind, I do not intend to take credit on any of this. I mostly do this to make it accessible to you. Thirdly, spec knowledge motions are varied. There are different realms which can require spec knowledge. My most difficult theme historically has always been IR, international relations, but I have known many people that have gaps in their knowledge on many other topics. Some people feel like they lack knowledge on gender issues. Some people feel like they lack knowledge on economy. Some people feel like they lack knowledge on technology. I'll try to provide examples from different things throughout the workshop. It is probably possible that I will give more examples of IR than others because this is what I'm more used to having struggles with personally. But if you have any specific questions and any motion you struggled with later on in the Q&A session or whatever, I'm happy to help you work around this motion as well. Do bear in mind, spec knowledge is not limited to any specific theme, and the tools that we're going to learn are applicable to both basically any theme. And lastly, I'm going to use some examples during the workshop. I always do. I think it is important to use examples in order to understand the skills better by using them on specific motions. It is not meant to say I either criticize nor endorse any of the motions that I give as examples. I chose them because I think they are good examples for this specific skill of testing spec knowledge issues. Some of them were given in contexts and tournaments where it was very reasonable to expect this knowledge, and it is not a criticism of DCAs in any way. Please don't infer me using any motion as saying it's necessarily good or bad. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are we going to discuss today? Just to give a quick roadmap. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the psychological aspects of spec knowledge motions and how not to stress out over them. This will be a brief but important one. The second thing will be the main skill we'll discuss today, which is first principles, how to find them, how to use them, and how they help us analyze any motion without knowing what it's about. The third thing would be analogies, which I think most people already do use, but often use them incorrectly. And we'll discuss how to use analogies and how not to use analogies to make them persuasive in debates that we're not sure what they are actually about. And lastly, we'll have a brief chat about OG, specifically PMing and giving definitions and models, how not to fuck up a room from this position, given how easy it is to mess up a model. Let's go to the first topic, psychology. So this is going to be one slide and it's going to be short because I don't want to teach you psychology, and I did say that I will teach you how to analyze debates about spec knowledge, but I want to make it very clear that the stress hurts your speeches more than your ignorance does. So while it's good to work on both, and we will discuss also how to analyze better, if it is a trade-off, if you can only work on one, work on your psychological approach to spec knowledge debates. I guarantee you the main loss to your points and speaks in these debates is because you stress out over knowing things more than it is about you actually not knowing things. Some important factors to remember, both to understand why this statement that I just said is true, but also to remind yourself and help you relax thinking of those in your mind. These are things that usually help me thinking about when I saw a motion that I had no idea what it's about. Firstly, you always know something about the motion. We'll give some examples later, but there's no such thing as knowing nothing. Even if you don't know a specific policy of any state that is discussed in the motion, probably the state is something you've heard about in the past. Probably you can geographically roughly allocate it, at least continentally, like this state is in Asia, this state is in Europe. Probably you know a bit about the global perception of the state as a global citizen yourself. So there's always something that you know. Try to focus on the things that you do know rather than the ones that you don't. Secondly, especially if you're not in the top room right now, it is extremely likely the rest of the room is also clueless. Don't feel like you're in any disadvantage because you don't know stuff, especially if you did learn and do your case file. It probably means that it was a very unexpected topic that other people didn't expect to come up as well. It's likely the chair doesn't know anything. It's likely the teams that compete against you don't know anything. So you're not in any disadvantage. You're on equal playing field with everyone else being ignorant as well in the most likely scenario. Fourthly, the CAs of the tenement are accountable to setting good motions. Try to think, in general, I think an advice regardless of this workshop is sometimes it's helpful to think of motions and why they were worded in one way or another from the perspective of CAs, what they had in mind when they set this motion, when the general rule to remember is CAs don't like backlash on their motions. CAs don't like when people claim their motions are bad and then don't want to ask them to CA again. If they have set it, they probably think that an info slide is not necessary, or that the information given in the info slide is sufficient. They have probably thought of how this motion will function in different rooms, including the bin room. They set these motions thinking that they will function and that you are able to get away with them without knowing more than what the motion gives you. So it means that if you take 2 minutes to think of it, you probably can. Fifthly, engagement doesn't require much knowledge. I guess I can factually disprove a claim, yeah, but it's not the only way to disprove a claim. I can logically disprove a claim and show that it doesn't prove its burdens of proof for the argument to stand. I can provide alternatives in many cases. There are many different forms of engagement I can do without knowing anything. And engagement alone can take you very far. And lastly, in 3 out of 4 positions, you have someone to copy from. If you're not OG, and we'll discuss OG in the last slide, you will have time to hear other people describing basic facts. If they were sufficient for their own arguments, you can probably weaponize them for your arguments as well. Are there any questions on this aspect before we discuss first principles? Okay, looks like a no, so let's move on. First principles. Definition. First principles are the fundamentals of the debate. It is the core questions or clashes at the heart of it. If you strip a debate off of its specific context and examples, what left is these first principles. These are usually the things that we want to look for when we are trying to analyze a motion that we don't have much information about. They are useful both for finding constructive arguments based on the motion alone and no other facts in addition to this. They are also good for refutations, because if we identify what are the core clashes and burdens of the motion, we don't need to know facts to prove that the other side is wrong. We can just show that they are not fulfilling their burdens, or they are being off clash, or they are ignoring a more important clash. All of this is based not on knowing the theme of the motion, but just knowing the meta of the debate, the core questions that it is aiming towards. How then do we find first principles? Can we go to the next slide, please? So, several methods that can help us out. Firstly, start by mapping out all the basic facts that you do know about the motion or can infer from the wording, and often the wording does give us some information. Let's start with a basic example, and this is going to be an open question for the audience, and I will ask you to participate. In the motion, this house, as Russia, will seize its economic support of Maduro's government in Venezuela. By the way, insofar as it is important for context, this motion was set in 2018, things have changed since, but let's ignore that. Let's say we don't know anything about the situation in Venezuela or the involvement of Russia in Venezuela. I want to ask you, the participants, not yet for arguments, what are facts that you definitely know are true, either from your personal general knowledge or can infer from the wording of the motion about Russia and Venezuela? Do I have any volunteers? Either raise your hand or write in the chat. Yeah, okay, so we have Abby mentioning that they have an oil crisis that led to economic collapse. That is true regarding Venezuela. Let's even go more basic than this. Say that we are completely ignorant and don't know even that. What else do we definitely know? Nice. Okay, so we get from Nivrapam in the chat also that just from the motion we can infer Russia is currently supporting the government in Venezuela. Note, I didn't have to know that it's true. It is definitely the case from the motion. If I go even a step further, by the way, I can try and use this information to infer even more facts or context, such as I might ask myself the two following questions. If I know that Russia is currently supporting Venezuela, it necessarily means two things. Firstly, there was a reason for them to support Venezuela in the past. Secondly, something has recently changed, and this is why we have a motion. Because if they didn't have a reason to support them in the past, they wouldn't have supported them. If nothing would have changed, the motion would be completely imbalanced. So just by reading the motion, I already know Russia supports Venezuela. They have had reasons to do so, and something is probably changing to make the reasons not as strong as before. What else can we think of? We have another suggestion in the chat. If Russia is involved, the US and Russia's animosity will maybe become a part of the debate as well. So that's also a good point. Note, knowing something about the motion, flagging to the earlier slide, I don't need to know everything to know something. Sometimes, as is the case for many European debaters, for example, they don't know much about Latin America, but they do know stuff about Russia in general. Even if I don't know anything about Venezuela, the fact that I know that Russia is a big global stakeholder, which also has interesting dynamics with the US and general aspirations to further its control globally, is a fact I can use in this motion, which can also help me think of what is the reason Russia has supported Venezuela so far. Anything else? More suggestions? Venezuela probably needs economic support. That's a very good one. So another thing that I can infer from this is something will change in Venezuela if Russia stops doing this, which will soon, as you will see when we continue with this example, lead to understanding some of the basic burdens for the motion. So if I'm trying to lay down what are the burdens for the motion, I now might realize that there is a question or a clash of what happens to the Maduro government absent Russia's support. I now understand that there is a clash, that maybe if I'm government, I want to prove that they will succeed anyway or fail anyway. Maybe if I'm op, I want to say that we have an incentive for them to succeed, and without our support, they will fail, but with it, they will succeed. I don't know yet how to prove it, but I understand already what my burdens are if I want to support a stance in the motion. More suggestions from the chat. Russia funds various countries. This is also something that we can generally probably know about the world, which also leads us to understanding of different extensions we can think of in this debate, such as possibly this will have an impact not only on Venezuela, but also on other allies of Russia and what a message they are going to get from this. Probably the Venezuelan government is a dictatorship or a communist establishment. So this is something that I think most debaters today already know, thankfully. But while we don't know for sure that it is a dictatorship or communist establishment just from the motion, we know that probably if they are backed by Russia, there is some level of past or present similarities between their governments that have led to cooperation, which could also direct us in this angle. So all this to show is we always do know stuff about the motion. Someone says it's an actual motion, which implies certain burdens. We'll get to that in the next slide. I don't want to jump ahead. But just from general knowledge about the world, as well as reading the motion and inferring what it means, I can already list down quite a few facts. And you don't need to do this alone. You also have your partner to help you. Start your prep by, let's just list down everything both of us know. Do you know anything about this? Take a minute or two, do that, and you will have these fundamental structures you will need to use later on in your arguments. These bits and pieces of knowledge can then later be connected to logics and general understanding of the world to ask ourselves key questions about the burdens, such as in most IR debates, a key question to ask ourselves is, what are the incentives as well as the abilities of the different stakeholders involved? So in this case, I might not know precisely what is Venezuela's economic situation, military situation, etc. I do know that it was supported by Russia, that there was some grounds for them to be supported in the past. So I want to think both what is the incentive of Venezuela in this collaboration, the incentive of Russia, and the ability of the Venezuelan government with or without Russia's support. All of these are just understanding the questions of the motion. And lastly, use what we call the why method to understand the burdens of proof for different arguments here. The why method is just a chain of endless questions of why until you reach a consensus. Think like a child that always asks, but why is that true? And why is that true? And why is that true? And we continue until we reach a basic premise that everyone can agree with. So let's say in this debate, after already doing all of the previous steps, if I'm OG, I can already start to understand, all right, probably Russia had some incentive of some sort of influence in Latin America, whether it is a political one or one revolving economy, maybe the oil situation, etc. Now, probably because of different political tensions and changes that happened in Venezuela, and maybe if I've read about it as well, I will also know to mention Guaido and the potential movement for rebellion, etc. I then know that probably something is leading to instability or change that made it not as profitable in the past. So now I want to probably argue the bottom line, and I do reverse engineering of it. I ask myself, what is the bottom line that I want to prove? I probably want to prove that Russia doesn't want to be involved in the instability, as an example. We want to be on the right side of history. We don't want to bet on a losing horse, just so after they fall or are replaced, we both carry the cost with them and maybe will be hated by the next regime. Okay, so now I ask myself, why? What do I need to prove for this to be true? Well, for starters, I need to prove that they are likely to fail. And I need to prove that they are likely to fail even if we do continue supporting them, because opposition will obviously say the opposite, right? No, they will fail if you stop, but if you continue, they will succeed. I also want to prove that if indeed they fail, we bear costs of it, whether it is in the visibility of it or the economic aspects of it, etc. And I also want to prove that if we bail now, we don't bear the costs. We can be in better terms with the next regime or not be too much involved in the economic harms that it creates. And now I just know what I need to prove. And a lot of these burdens, I don't need to know anything specific about Venezuela in order to analyze them. I can use generic analysis that I know for many other motions such as this to explain why these burdens are likely to be true. So if I want to say that it is likely that regardless of Russia's economic support, Maduro's government will fail, I need to analyze why it's probably likely that money isn't going to be the determining factor. Maybe it's because money is becoming irrelevant when most of it doesn't trickle down to the people due to corruption and bad economic policies, which leads to massive displeasure with the current government. Maybe it's because the soldiers are already fearing of the potential for the rebellion succeeding and therefore won't stick by with Maduro even if they pay them, because they are afraid that if they lose, people will be after their heads. Maybe they want to be the ones to replace and be on the next regime. It's a lot of maybes, but all of these things are things that regardless of the factual accuracy of, I can logically infer that could be likely cases. I just ask myself, what can money buy and what can't money buy? And I use this to explain why are the things that it can buy not sufficient to hold Maduro in power. Next slide, please. So the next thing, which was already suggested in the chat earlier, that often helps us identify the basic core clashes in the first principles of the motion, is using the structure of burdens for different motion types. So I don't know if you've already had this lesson. I know some universities do it, some universities don't. A very brief overview of the burdens of proof for different motion types. Policy is the most classic, straightforward one. Problem, solution, justification, utility, alternatives. That is, we start with what is the problem? Why is the policy needed? Why the motion solves the problem? Why the solution is justified? Why does the solution does more good than harm? And why is it the only or the best solution out of all the alternatives? Without knowing what motion it is, if I prove these 5 burdens, I prove the motion. It's true for any sort of policy debate ever. Of course, in some of them, some burdens will be more important than the others. Burdens are created equal, but it helps me understand what are the arguments I'm looking for. So without knowing anything, just when I say policy debate, this house would, this house would ban, this house would legalize, this house would subsidize, etc., I already know what general heuristic to use to come up with arguments. I'll try to ask myself, what is the problem that the motion is probably aiming to solve? And is it likely that opposition will contest or not contest the problem? Does the motion solve the problem? Is it likely that opposition will contest this? And so on and so forth. In regret motions, the 2 key burdens are to prove the likely counterfactual and the normative value of the counterfactual. So what do I mean by this? Usually there will be a big clash on what is the counterfactual, absent the thing that we regret, what would have happened? And secondly, would that thing that had happened, would that counterfactual be preferable or worse than the status quo? Actor motions, as mentioned before, 2 biggest questions. A, what are the main interests of the actor in question? Or in the earlier example we had, what are the main interests of Russia as an actor? And secondly, where are those interests better fulfilled or served? Analysis is more of a tricky one. It varies mostly because there are a lot of different analysis motions. You have this house prefers, you have this house, you have this house prefers the world, you have this house prefers X over Y, you have this house believes that, many different analysis motions. As a general thing, usually there will be a clash about characterization of the likely implication of this in real life, because in analysis, as opposed to policy, we do not have models yet. We cannot define how a policy will be implemented. So we need to describe how it is likely to look like in real life. And another key question usually in analysis debates, to jump ahead with the last statement, would be, what is the metric to judge the debate, or what do we care about? What is the good? What is the preferable thing to aspire to? But these things vary a lot from motion to motion in analysis. One advice that I will give you is analysis motions are often, not always, but often a way to present another type of motion while stripping them off from one burden or another. So as an example, if I want to set, instead of the motion, this house would stream kids based on their potential to different classes, as opposed to this house believes that kids should be streamed based on their skills and abilities and potential. It is a policy in hiding of analysis in which usually the main clash or the main burden that is stripping off is the one of solution. If we turn a policy motion into analysis, usually it's because we don't want to discuss efficacy. We don't want to have mechanism and mech bashing. We want it to be about the core question of, would it be good if it happened, not is it feasible? Or similarly, this house believes that X is in the interest of Y is an actor motion in hiding, in which usually we have more of the question of what are the interests of the actor and less of where are they better served, because we have the presumption that X is going to happen and we don't need to analyze that. So it's not always the case, but something good to remember is that often analysis motions are other motion types in hiding, and if we identify what the other motion type is, it will help us find the burdens. In any case, these heuristics, this general scheme of how burdens look for different motion types, will also help us find arguments without knowing much about the motion. Secondly, as a rule of thumb, try and strip the motion off of its specific terms and substitute them for generic ones. So in the previous example, and I'll soon take a question, if the previous motion was this house as Russia would seize economic support of Maduro's regime in Venezuela, if I were trying to read the motion without its specifics, but only its general clashes, I would rephrase it in my head as this house believes, or this house as state X would seize economic support of leader Y in state Z. Later on, I can think of the specific implications of what it means that X is Russia, Z is Venezuela, and Y is Maduro. But just thinking of the basic structure of the motion without its specifics helps me understand already what are the clashes. I need to analyze what are the incentives of state X. I need to analyze what is likely to change in the regime of Y in state Z. All of these things will be applicable no matter what I substitute X, Y, and Z for. Yeah, I see a question from Preda. Was it accidental? I saw a raised hand earlier. Okay, seems like it was accidental, so I'll move on. Let's do a small practice of it together. So, in the motion, this house believes that states should prioritize bilateral trade deals over large regional trade deals, such as the TPP and RCEP. Let's try and identify, and let's assume for the purpose of the practice that we don't know the TPP and the RCEP, and even if you do, pretend that you don't, and try to identify what are the main questions or fundamentals that we need to prove and argue on in this motion. What are likely to be the clashes and the burdens? So, anyone has any ideas? You're welcome to suggest them in chat or raise your hand. You can take a minute or so to think. Okay, so we have one suggestion. States have some incentives that are fulfilled by one of the two options. Okay, Let's try now to word it as a question to identify what is the clash that we are aiming for at. Some incentives will always be true. A key question that we want to ask ourselves is possibly, what are the incentives of states when signing trade agreements? Anyone has any ideas? Without knowing anything specific about this or econ or the difference between bilateral deals and regional deals, what are the incentives of states when they sign trade agreements in general? Getting more money is a very long-term purpose. What leads to getting more money? Before we get to the profits, what are basic aspects that we consider? If we were to think of yourself as advisors for a specific country that considers getting into a trade deal, if you were to tell them just, you want to get more money, they would tell you, okay, no shit, Sherlock. What would you ask them to specifically investigate? Or in other words, if you don't know facts about this motion, assume that you had the internet, what would you search for? What would you research? What are the questions? Okay, so one thing suggested in chat is the ability to sell to more people with low restrictions. So in other words, one factor that we want to consider is, where do we get better access to a bigger market? A second suggestion in the chat, which I think is very good, is it shouldn't be exploitative. So in other words, another thing we would suggest that you should investigate is, what are the power dynamics in the trade agreement? Who has the negotiation leverage? What else? What should we ask ourselves? What would we research and investigate if we had the time and the internet with us when considering one or another? This is also, by the way, a rule of thumb that is useful to have. Always, if you're not sure how to approach a motion because you don't know stuff about it, ask yourself, what don't you know about it? If you could Google anything, what would you Google? Just knowing what would you need to search for helps you understand the questions, and the questions will lead you to the clashes. So we have reach to more people. We have power dynamics. Okay, another suggestion. What are the geopolitical influences of this? How is it going to impact me in other non-economic spheres necessarily? How is it going to internally seem? What are the alliances of the country that you are trading with? How is it going to impact relations with other states? Another one, which I think is very good, which is more stable, which is going to last longer. A big incentive that states have when they do trade deals is they want them to last for many years. We can go on and on with this. It's a wide debate. I think it's very deep. The big thing to notice here is, even if you know nothing about these trade deals, even if you know nothing about econ, you know what are the general goals that states have when entering trade deals. And these can help you identify the clashes. One clash can be about power dynamics. Which trade deals are more likely to be balanced and fair? One clash can be about sustainability. Which trade deals are more likely to last for long? And we can go on with this just by understanding what are the incentives of countries. And then we don't need to know much about economy to be able to fulfill these clashes and analyze on them. So I'll direct this question to you. If, say, we're opening the clash on exploitativeness, either for gov or for op, what are general reasons or mechanisms you could provide for either bilateral agreements or regional agreements being more exploitative?
Larger trade deals can be more exploitative because they involve more people, more supply chains. So there is a higher chance.
Okay, so one thing I can say on Gov is that when we have large agreements, we usually involve small states with big states, and therefore it's likely to have a disparity between them. Probably the impact of the bigger states on the terms of the deal will be larger. Let's do the flip of it. Let's say we are on op. We want to say large trade deals are actually, large regional trade deals are actually better. How would you possibly mechanize why bilateral deals are more likely to be exploitative?
Often bilateral deals occur between like economic superpowers and smaller nations, quote unquote, smaller nations.
And then what? Why is it worse than when they trade in a regional deal?
The superpowers probably have more leverage because they could just go and make a trade deal with someone.
So I could also argue, when we have many small states in a big regional deal, we actually have more negotiation leverage when we work together, as opposed to just me against the US or me against China. Now it's all of us together. None of this requires any big econ brain. I never studied econ, okay? It will probably also not get you to the middle high 80s or whatever, but it can get a solid second or even first with moderate speaks by just going with general logical mechanisms to fulfill the burdens as soon as you identify what the burdens are. Are there any questions so far? Okay, in which case, let's move on to the next tool that we can use. So can we move to the next slide? Awesome. Analogies. The general idea behind analogies is you often don't know stuff about the motion, but you often do know other motions which are very similar to it, and you can try and copy the general structure of the analysis from one motion to another. So a common example that many people know already is the black market cases being applicable with very similar analysis to almost any debate. So it doesn't matter if what the debate is legalizing is sex work, drugs, organs harvesting, not organs harvesting, but organs trade. I'm not sure what's the other term for this in English. Literally any sort of good or service that is currently illegal and we are legalizing, someone is going to argue for a black market. And the structure of how to do this is going to be very similar. You're going to have specific nuances that vary, but you are still going to need to prove that the law isn't effective right now, that the motion will lead to most people leaving the black market and going to a regulated one, and that the regulated market is better, and that when the market is not regulated, you still have many people using it. This is true for any motion that has a black market argument, regardless of its specifics. So while this is a very simplistic example, analogies are applicable to almost every motion. You can almost always think of a motion that is similar to the one at hand that you do have more knowledge about. And people I see do often use it. The problem is how to use it. So firstly, and most importantly, ask yourself what is similar in the analogy and what isn't similar in the analogy. So here, the thing to remember is people choose an analogy and often think, because it's similar, it's just the same. And because it is the same, it means that I can just use the exact same logic and it will work. Most often it won't be the case. Debates, contexts matter. Usually what we can use is the structure of the burdens, but not necessarily the specific mechanisms. So in the example of black market arguments, the burden of proving that the law isn't effective in criminalizing it is going to always stay the same. The way to fulfill this burden is going to change drastically. So if the motion is about drugs, I will probably want to say that people are addicted and there is too much financial incentive involved in it for the law to be effective. If it's a motion about, say, legalizing trade of organs, I would say people who literally fear their lives are willing to pay any cost in any market, legal or illegal, to save their lives or the lives of their loved ones. Different mechanisms, same burden. So the thing to remember is, remember both what you know is similar and don't overly rely on what you not know for sure is similar. Secondly, and on the same lines, use the analogy to help you analyze, but don't analyze the analogy. So another thing I often see speakers do is they say, this is like what we had in my country. And in my country, this works because A, B, and C. And then I forget to ever connect the analogy to the original motion. The point of the analogy is to help you think of the structure for the argument, not to replace it. You still need to connect it to the specific motion to make it persuasive. So you can give it as an example. You can and you should use it to help you identify the burdens, but always connect it back to the original motion. I'll start with a complicated example and then do a less complicated practice, which I just realized, given the context in which I'm giving this workshop, I usually give it for more European audience, might be a flipped one. In any case, in the context, let's start with the example. This house would ban members in the Sri Lanka military and the Tamil Tigers from running for government elections. This was a motion that famously a team from Israel once debated. I don't know if you know anything about the motion. They didn't know anything about Sri Lanka nor about the Tamil Tigers. I'm going to give a very Israeli example here because this is the analogy they used that is more intuitive to people from our cultural context. Let's try and dispatch this motion to its fundamental principles. A, what do we know? Sri Lanka, a state, it's small, it's an island, it's in the Indian Ocean. That's pretty much it. Probably, inferring from the motion and the way it's worded, there was some internal struggle between the Sri Lanka military and the Tamil Tigers. Probably, it means that if there is a struggle between the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lanka military, it is some form of an not legal combat organization or militia. So either terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on the context, we don't know. Probably this struggle was violent because otherwise we wouldn't need to legally intervene in their ability to run for elections. Probably there are elections soon, otherwise we wouldn't need the motion right now. There is a reason why the CAs have set it at this time. And probably there is a lot of disagreements and conflicts in the general population in terms of who supports what. Otherwise, again, no point in politicizing them and then going for elections. Probably there are supporters and opposers for both. Okay, what can we know that is similar to this? Israelis immediately thought of the example of Hamas. Internal war, at least semi-democratic election system, struggles and hate between different groups. Ask ourselves, what would have happened if Hamas were to run for elections in Israel? And start running from there. Now, clearly, you can't fully copy this example. There are differences, and it would be wrong to try and use the exact same context. But it does help you understand what are the general clashes here. Like, how is it likely to impact the internal peace or the internal infights when it is legal and when it is illegal? What is likely to happen policy-wise if one of them wins? And so on and so forth. Point being, they got a second, and the chair by the end of it said the famous quote, you know, I wish you would show even more of how much you know about the Tamil Tigers. And this is basically the example to show that in the most extreme scenario, and usually we like telling this example because people, at least in our context, really don't know anything about it. Even without any information, if you use reverse engineering to identify what can be said about the motion, what is it similar to, but you're also modest enough to not say that it is completely the same and know what to use and what not to use, you can get away with it. You can make a basic case that gets a solid second. Let's do a practice. I'm going to caveat this practice a bit. So usually this example is one that I give for European debaters because usually the analogy that European debaters that don't know much about ASEAN, so the motion for practice is this house as ASEAN would suspend Myanmar's membership. It was set recently. Actually, the last time that I used this example was before the recent developments in Myanmar, given military coup and stuff, when it was mostly about the situation of treatment of Uyghurs in Myanmar. Not Uyghurs, sorry, the Rohingya, Uyghurs, China. I'm confused because of time. Anyway, point is, most Europeans like comparing ASEAN and the European Union. Presumably, in the context of this audience, you know actually more about ASEAN than you know about the EU. So regardless of this specific motion, let's try to think of general analogies, and we can do this from the flip direction. What do you think can be drawn as similarities and differences between ASEAN and the EU? If you were to analyze any motion about the EU without knowing its specifics, or if you were to think of the perspective of a European debating ASEAN, what do you think is important to remember that is similar and what is different? Suggestions in chat or raise your hand. Okay, ASEAN is also an economic zone, is a similarity. Mostly made of smaller countries. What else? What could be argued as similar? What could be argued as different? Okay, a difference is the economic situation of the said blocks. I think these are two differences. So one thing to be mentioned is the EU is obviously very wealthy, whereas ASEAN states not always are, but the keyword is not always. What could you think of another potential economic difference that might make the debates very different? So one thing, okay, so I'm going to go through the chat soon, but one thing that I suggest remembering about the economic differences as well, which I think many teams often miss in the comparisons, is also the economic gaps are very not the same. So while economic gaps exist in both, the difference between Singapore and Vietnam is not the same as the difference between Germany and Poland. While both have gaps, the margin of difference is larger. Another suggestion of a difference, which is very important. ASEAN is not as integrated as the EU. That's very true. The EU has its own legislation, regulations, currency. I would also say this is also true, not just legal aspects wise, but also culturally. As much as Europeans like to think that we are so very different, and the big difference between the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Protestants, for the most part, we're talking about similar ethnicity, similar religions, similar democratic situation with very marginal differences, as opposed to ASEAN, which has very big differences in religion, culture, history, etc. But also, yes, in legislation, regulations, and so on. EU has colonizer money. I would also say the flip of this. ASEAN has many post-colonial countries, which also impacts the dynamics differently, which is not very much the case in the EU. The EU has perhaps more control over everyday aspects. I think this connects back to the regulation. And yes, the EU is more intergovernmental. ASEAN is not intervening in each other's domestic problems. The importance of this is, once we know the similarities and the differences, we know which kinds of analysis we can borrow and which we can't borrow. So as an example, if I were to give you a motion that is somewhat, but not fully analogous to the one about ASEAN and Myanmar, let's give the flip example here. This House, as the European Union, would suspend Hungary's membership. What do you think you could say and what couldn't you say on the motion using the analogy? You don't need to know a lot about the EU and Hungary to be able to debate this. let's start by what we can infer from the motion itself. If there is even a question, yeah, they're at odds ideologically, something suggested in the chat. Ask for yourselves, if it's even a question, if there's a motion that maybe Hungary should be suspended in membership, what does it tell us about them, even without knowing anything about Hungary? So it tells us, according to the chat, that probably Hungary isn't fulfilling its membership criteria. Maybe it's doing some wrong that the EU wants to intervene in. Also, similar to what we can borrow in similarities to ASEAN, we know that probably there is an interest for the EU to be large and sustain its members, right? We know that probably there needs to be some strong reason for this. It's not going to be about every small disagreement. Probably they do want countries to stay. Hungary is likely to be isolated given the integrated nature of the EU. So that's actually an interesting question here. Let's see. Let's use the analogy. Given the example that you might know better of ASEAN and Myanmar, would you say that Myanmar might have another potential trade partner if ASEAN suspends their membership? Anyone has any ideas? Or would Myanmar be isolated completely? Okay, someone says in the chat not isolated. Who do you think they would still trade with? Okay, bilateral trades can definitely happen in the EU as well. If you know the extra knowledge, you can also say that there are already states which are not members of the EU which have bilateral trades, similar to what Britain is currently attempting to do post-Brexit, and not with always much success. Another thing that was mentioned is there is another local superpower, China, might still trade with Myanmar. Is there another local superpower that might still trade with Hungary in Europe? Russia suggested in the chat. So again, not knowing a whole lot about the current stakeholders there, I know that there is another big economy, which also happens to be geographically proximate because Eastern Europe, that doesn't care as much as the EU about democratic practices. I might be able to use this as an example. Now, again, we need to be careful with this. We can't borrow fully the whole analogy. We can't assume that the specific economic incentives that Russia might have in Hungary are similar. We cannot assume that the specific wrong that Hungary is doing is similar to either a military coup in present day or to suspending citizenships of a local minority in past days. But we know that they probably did something undemocratic. All of these things are just borrowing from understanding what is similar and what isn't similar. Just asking yourself the question, what do we know for certain and what we can't know for certain and we cannot assume? So these are things that often help us in analogies. Just keep in mind always both the similarities and the differences. Are there questions so far? Okay, if there are no questions, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so one question in the chat is how can I draw analogies of the actors? So I cannot draw full analogies of their full incentives and specifics. What I can do is try to think of analogous actors in similarities. So in the previous example, one way in which I thought of possibly Russia is ask myself, okay, I know that in the case of Myanmar, I was trying to think of an economic power which is rather large, geographically proximate, and has conflicting incentives to ASEAN. By analogy, is there an economic actor which is rather large, geographically proximate, and has conflicting interests with the EU? And this helps me spot Russia as a potential actor. Similarly, if I want to draw the analogy between Hungary and Myanmar, from one direction or another, based on which one you know more, one of them I know is a member which is relatively economically weak and somewhat dependent and has democratic struggles. I can think by analogy, if there is another union which has strong enough reasons to take away another state, but is also probably powerful enough to take away another state. So we know it's probably not the biggest country or the most powerful country in the EU, otherwise it wouldn't be feasible. By analogy, it's likely similar to an extent. And to an extent is a big thing here, right? Just as context, the problems in Hungary were, as much as I hate Hungary's policies on this aspect, are not on the same scale in any way as taking citizenships. It's mostly things that my own government does as well, to an extent, which are blocking free press and media locally, blocking foreign press, etc. Also some levels of oppression of minorities on the legal aspect, but not to the extent of taking away citizenships. So I wouldn't take these specific problems because I know these are very specific to context. I would take the things that are likely to be in common from the way that the motion is worded. It's likely that the state isn't too powerful in relation to the rest of the state, so it would be feasible. It's likely that they did something wrong and undemocratic. Any more questions? Okay. Definitions and models, or how to not screw over a debate from OG when you're in a spec knowledge motion you don't know much about. First, the thing is, again, reminding the first slide, don't stress over it. The key thing is to be a bit modest in the model. So often, in debates that we do know stuff about, we will try to think of a model in a way that will help our argumentation, putting specific things in it, specific mechanisms, specific examples that can help determine what the strength of our argument will be, that could pre-butt other arguments, that could frame the debate to make one argument more important than another, etc. If we don't know much about the motion, we want to be as basic and as solid and as simple as possible. This is not the time to try and break the motion in your favor. This is not the time to try to think of a model that creates for new cases or pre-butts other cases. This is the time to go back to the basics. Think what is likely to be a definition of this debate. Think of other things that it might be similar to. And most importantly, think of a balanced definition. Keep in mind that DCAs that have set this motion thought this to be a balanced motion. While they sometimes might be wrong, it is unlikely that they set a debate about something that is completely undefendable or unrefutable. It is probably something that has both goods and harms to it. And if you're not sure exactly how to define it, try to think of what is the most likely interpretation, which is also a balanced one. Take clarifications when they are suggested and take the time to answer them. If you were challenged, probably play along. It is hard to fight over a model's legitimacy when you're not sure it is true or loyal to real life. And for this reason as well, don't rely on your definition or model too much. Don't make cases that are completely based on the model or definition. Try to make your arguments as independent as possible and applicable to every different definition of the debate. So even if your interpretation is off, your case remains the same. I'll give an example and then we'll do a practice. An example from an old tournament. This house believes that white feminism did more harm than good. No info slide. Let's assume for the purpose of this motion or of this practice that you do not know what white feminism is, even if some of you do know it in real life. One thing that I saw Tim do in this debate when I judged it back then, and I think is a valuable lesson to learn from, is they decided to define white feminism in a way that was a bit too convenient for government. They said, well, white feminism is obviously feminism only and exclusively for white women, that says that any non-white woman is bad, and that feminism should always only be for white people, and that racism is good. They were challenged, they doubled down on the definition, they lost. Now, to be clear, obviously, inclusion of minorities is part of government stance in this debate. We can definitely infer from the term white feminism that it wasn't fully inclusive. But if we're being generous towards opposition, and if we're thinking the CAs must have thought there is a debate here, we can assume that probably it is not as blatantly so. It is more likely to be the case that rather than being defined as anti-non-white people, it was feminism that was led and started by white women, that possibly prioritized first world women's issues and possibly prioritized white women's issues. It is probably an older or more conservative version of feminism that existed before inclusivity and intersectional feminism was popular. We can infer that there's probably an up, otherwise there wouldn't be a debate. It's helpful to think also of what the up is likely to be in this debate. It might be the case that on the one hand, it says white, on the other hand, it says feminism. It probably still helped some women at least. Probably up is going to say that a lot of the struggles women face are not not related to ethnicity, that possibly the fight for abortions and equal pay, etc., helped everyone. So even if it started off for the wrong reasons, it did a good job. And when I understand this, I am likely to give a more solid definition. I won't go as far as saying it is blatantly trying to say that women who are not white shouldn't have rights. It just didn't prioritize them. It was mostly centered around white women and their issues. And then I can go to make arguments that are more linked to the likelier definition of the debate. Probably it misprioritized some important issues. Probably it made feminism less inclusive and approachable to women of color, which led to them not feeling convenient in feminism when sometimes some of them were conservative and needed feminism's help more, and were already skeptical about it. Possibly it led to some struggles when sometimes there's maybe a direct clash between incentives of white women and other women, such as maybe it helped get white women out to the workforce by replacing their home labor with women of color doing their cleaning and cooking for them, and then it only harmed other women. All of these things are arguments I can come up with if I understand that there should be an up. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a debate. If I'm trying to take the most convenient definition, I am most likely missing the debate. Let's take a practice of it to do together. Assume that we don't know much about technology. The motion, this house supports the rise of computational creativity. No info slide provided on what computational creativity is. You're OG. How would you define computational creativity? What is it likely to be or to include? And what is it likely to not include? Suggestions as always in the chat or by raising hand. Okay, so it's about creativity that arises from computer or artificial intelligence. All right, what does it likely entail? What does it likely include? Can you give me maybe examples of things that you think it can or can't do? Okay, so it can probably write songs, poems, stories. Maybe it can generate games. I see the term class struggles in the chat. I'm not sure what's the meaning from it. Can you elaborate? You can unmute for that. I'm asking currently not for arguments you would say, but how would you define computational creativity? So can people give more examples of things that they think are included? And possibly also examples of things that you think are not included. It's also helpful to think and bear in mind what computational creativity probably doesn't do. By the way, something that can help us here as well is inferring stuff from the wording of the motion. As an example, in this practice, the motion says this house supports. Supports always talks about something that exists in the status quo. It's not this house believes that we should aspire to. It means it already exists, and knowing that it already exists can help us know what it does and doesn't replace, because we know some things are not replaced by AI yet. So one suggested is creativity aided with computers, like a human song with AI autotune. Possibly, I'm not sure that we can necessarily infer that it cannot help humans with creativity. Okay, so one suggestion is it probably cannot generate something completely new. By the way, this is also something that we can analyze to be likely. From the way that AI works, it mostly works on learning from previous practices and copying patterns that it is found to be helpful. So it's probably limited in the level of creativity it can have, maybe. What else? Try to think of things that you know today computers can't do, even the best computers. Or can't do yet, at least. As a hint, it's helpful to think of what Op will try and argue in this debate. What are the reasons to oppose computational creativity? Okay, so one suggestion is it probably cannot take moral choices. The word jobs is a bit too wide. I think there already are today jobs that are done by technology, but what kind of jobs is it likely to not yet be able to do? And the direction of jobs is good. It comes from thinking of what opposition will try and run. So I can say probably that it is still unable to replace jobs which are very much based on human contact, such as it can't be a psychologist, maybe. Maybe I can say that it cannot take jobs which are very heavily reliant on moral judgments, such as it cannot be a judge in most criminal cases. I don't know if I would say it's suggested in the chat that maybe they cannot write the script of an audio-visual drama. I don't know if I would go there. So two things to remember. A, the fact that it describes a phenomenon that happens in the status quo. The word rise is also important in the motion, not just the word supports. We do know that it is still on the rise. It can improve to an extent. And B, we also want to think that there are government arguments here. Like we are OGs, we still want to have our own constructive. So we probably want to say that it does do something. It has advantages. So I wouldn't rule out fully artistic things. But the point is, I would probably want to define it as something that does have some level of creativity, is able to replace some human functions of creativity, but cannot replace the very high level things that require inner thoughts, introspection, moral and empathy, etc., because empathy is not part of creativity, morality is not part of creativity. And I can also back it by real life examples and say, look, this house supports. It can probably do things such as write certain songs, but it probably cannot do things such as be your therapist, because we know that these are the things that currently exist. And then I can base arguments on it. What I certainly don't want to do is to try and define computational creativity in the way that would be most convenient for Gov and not necessarily connected to reality. Like saying, obviously, it creates a cure for cancer, which is not something we know to still happen, or obviously, it is just the old-fashioned technology that does simple tasks and cannot replace any sort of human job. We are trying to think both what we know from real life as well as what is charitable towards opposition? What is likely to be the balanced definition of it? Now, the nice thing about it is, even if it's not the right definition, even if you get it wrong, so long as you make it balanced, you are risking challenges less for two reasons. Firstly, teams don't like to challenge for no reason. Challenge is messy. Challenge leads judges to hate you because you make for a messy debate. Challenges take your time, etc. Challenges are risky. Teams only challenge a definition if they think that they need to do this to win, if they feel the definition is unfair towards them. If you give a fair definition, even if it is inaccurate, they won't have an incentive to challenge you. Secondly, judges won't always buy it. If you give a fair definition, and assuming the judge is also not an expert on the field and doesn't know that you're wrong, they won't accept any challenge that you're given, because if it's fair, there's no reason to. So the thing to remember here is just be solid, give something that is likely to be true from what you know in real life and from what you know about the motion's supposed balancedness, and move on from there. Make your arguments fit this definition. In any case, I do suggest in OG that DPM doesn't fully prepare their case in advance. I say it in most debates, by the way, but especially in spec knowledge debates, which you don't know much about. DPM should help Prime Minister write their speech and be fully attentive to leader of opposition and make their own speech based on that, whether in rebuttals, weighings, rebuildings, after they hear facts and challenges from leader of opposition and they know more what the debate that happened is about. And always remember, you don't need to win the debate in real life. You need to win the debate that happened in the room. So if something is not challenged, if something is ended up being agreed upon, even if it's factually wrong, it doesn't impact your scores by the end of it. So the important thing is just to listen and be adjustable to the debate that you have at hand. This is the last slide that I have for this workshop. Are there any questions in general, any motions that you would like to practice together or anything